Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little nauseating. A time when death stalked every street and no prayer could save you from the inevitable. We're diving into what the Black Death truly felt like, day by agonizing day, where entire families vanished within a week and the living envied the dead. Forget the sanitized history books that gloss over the true horror. The truth is, you probably wouldn't survive even the first symptoms of this medieval nightmare. So before you get comfortable, make sure to like this video if you enjoy learning about history's most miserable experiences, and subscribe for more content that'll make you grateful for modern life. Hit that notification bell too, because we're constantly uploading new stories about humanity's most uncomfortable moments. Now dim the lights, get cozy, and prepare to discover why the Black Death was humanity's most terrifying experience, where every dawn brought fresh corpses and every sunset promised more death to come. Welcome to 1348, where hope died faster than the people who carried it. Your journey into the Black Death begins not with dramatic collapse, but with subtle symptoms that you initially dismiss as nothing more than the common ailments that plague medieval life. You wake up feeling slightly unwell, perhaps attributing the discomfort to yesterday's questionable meal, or the damp cold that permeates your cramped dwelling. The ache in your joints feels familiar, like the chronic pain that affects everyone in your harsh world. The morning starts normally enough in your medieval village, where life revolves around survival and the constant struggle against hunger, cold, and disease. Your small dwelling offers minimal protection from the elements, with gaps in the walls that allow cold air to seep through and floors that remain perpetually damp from the lack of proper drainage. You share this cramped space with your family members, livestock, and whatever vermin have taken up residence in the straw bedding and wooden beams. As you begin your daily routine, you notice a slight heaviness in your limbs that makes simple tasks feel more difficult than usual. The water you fetch from the communal well seems colder than normal against your skin, and you find yourself shivering despite wearing the same rough woolen clothing that usually provides adequate warmth. These early symptoms are so subtle that you don't yet realize you're experiencing the first stage of a disease that will kill you within a week. The headache that develops during the morning hours feels different from the usual discomfort caused by poor nutrition and stress. This pain has a deep, throbbing quality that seems to originate from behind your eyes and spread throughout your skull like a slow-moving tide of agony. You try to continue with your work, but concentration becomes increasingly difficult as the pain intensifies and your vision begins to blur slightly around the edges. Your appetite, never robust due to the chronic malnutrition that affects most people in your social class, disappears entirely by midday. The sight and smell of food that once seemed appealing now cause a wave of nausea that makes your stomach churn and your mouth fill with saliva. You attempt to force down a piece of coarse bread, but swallowing becomes difficult and the food sits heavily in your stomach like a stone. The slight fever that begins in the afternoon initially provides some relief from the constant cold that plagues your daily existence. Your skin feels warm to the touch, and for a brief moment, you might even feel grateful for the internal heat that seems to be protecting you from the chill air. However, this warmth quickly becomes uncomfortable as your body temperature continues to rise beyond normal levels, causing you to alternate between feeling overheated and experiencing sudden chills that make your teeth chatter. By evening, the fatigue has become overwhelming, making even simple movements feel like tremendous efforts that drain what little energy remains in your body. Walking across your small dwelling requires conscious effort, and you find yourself leaning against walls and furniture for support. Your breathing becomes slightly laboured, not enough to cause alarm, but sufficient to create a constant awareness that something is wrong with your body's normal functioning. The swollen lymph nodes that will soon become the most visible sign of your condition begin as small, tender lumps that you might initially mistake for the minor injuries and infections that are common in your harsh daily life. These swellings, located in your neck, armpits, and groin, are barely noticeable at first and cause only mild discomfort when touched. You might attribute them to sleeping in an awkward position or to the physical labour that defines your existence. Sleep, when it finally comes, is fitful and filled with strange dreams that seem more vivid and disturbing than your usual nighttime experiences. You toss and turn on your straw mattress, unable to find a comfortable position, as your body temperature fluctuates and your joints ache with a deep, persistent pain. The fever causes you to sweat despite the cold air, soaking your clothing and bedding with moisture that never seems to dry in the damp conditions of your dwelling. During the night, you wake repeatedly with a thirst that seems impossible to satisfy, no matter how much water you consume. Your mouth feels dry and sticky, while your tongue has developed a strange coating that affects the taste of everything you try to drink. The water that usually tastes acceptable now has an unpleasant metallic flavour that makes you grimace with each swallow. Your family members begin to notice your discomfort, but in a world where illness and suffering are constant companions, your symptoms don't yet cause serious alarm. They might offer you extra blankets, or suggest simple remedies like herbal teas made from whatever plants are available. But the concept of contagious disease is poorly understood, and they continue to share your living space and sleeping area without taking any protective measures. The night brings no relief from your growing discomfort, and you begin to suspect that this illness might be more serious than the minor ailments you've experienced before. However, you still have no way of knowing that you're in the early stages of a disease that has already killed millions of people across Europe and will soon claim your life and the lives of everyone you know and love. As dawn approaches, your condition has progressed enough that ignoring the symptoms becomes impossible, but you still retain enough strength to move around and attempt to continue with your daily routine. The full horror of what's happening to your body is still hidden beneath symptoms that seem manageable, even if uncomfortable. You have no way of knowing that by this time tomorrow, your condition will have deteriorated so dramatically that survival will become questionable. Welcome to day one of the Black Death, where the seeds of your destruction have been planted but haven't yet sprouted into the full flower of medieval medicine's most terrifying disease. Your second day with the Black Death begins with the grim realization that yesterday's discomfort was not a temporary ailment that would resolve with rest and simple remedies. The fever that seemed manageable 12 hours ago has intensified into a burning heat that makes your skin feel like it's on fire, while simultaneously causing violent chills that shake your entire body with uncontrollable tremors. The morning light filtering through the gaps in your dwelling seems unnaturally bright and painful to your eyes, forcing you to squint and turn away from even the weak sunshine that manages to penetrate the perpetual gloom of your medieval hovel. This photophobia adds another layer of misery to your growing collection of symptoms, making it difficult to navigate your familiar surroundings and forcing you to retreat to the darkest corners of your already dim living space. Your appetite has completely vanished, replaced by a constant nausea that makes the thought of food repulsive and the smell of cooking meat from neighbouring dwellings enough to trigger violent retching episodes. The simple act of swallowing has become painful and difficult, as if your throat has been lined with a rough cloth that catches on everything that passes through. Even water, essential for survival, becomes a challenge to consume as your body rebels against nearly everything you attempt to ingest. The lymph nodes that were merely tender yesterday have swollen dramatically overnight, growing from small lumps into large, painful masses that feel like stones embedded beneath your skin. These buboes, as they will later be known, are most prominent in your neck, armpits, and groin, where they create visible bulges that make movement painful and sleep nearly impossible. The skin over these swellings has become hot and red, indicating the intense inflammation occurring beneath the surface. The pain from these swollen glands is unlike anything you've experienced before, a deep throbbing agony that seems to pulse in rhythm with your heartbeat and radiate outward into the surrounding tissue. Touching these areas accidentally while moving or adjusting your position causes spikes of pain so intense they bring tears to your eyes and force involuntary cries from your lips. Your body temperature continues to fluctuate wildly throughout the day, causing you to alternate between periods of burning heat, where you feel like you're cooking from the inside, and episodes of bone-deep cold that no amount of blankets or proximity to the fire can alleviate. These temperature swings leave you exhausted and disoriented, unable to regulate your comfort or find any position that provides relief from the thermal torture your body's inflicting upon itself. The headache that began yesterday has evolved into a constant crushing pain that feels like an iron band tightening around your skull, with each beat of your heart. This cephalic agony makes concentration impossible, and turns even simple thoughts into monumental efforts that leave you mentally exhausted. The pain behind your eyes is intensified to the point where moving them in their sockets causes sharp spikes of discomfort that radiate through your entire head. Breathing, once an unconscious action that required no thought or effort, begins to require conscious attention as your lungs struggle to extract adequate oxygen from each breath. You find yourself taking deeper, more laboured respirations, but somehow never feeling like you're getting enough air. This respiratory distress creates a constant sense of anxiety and panic that compounds your physical suffering with psychological torment. Your skin has taken on an unhealthy pallor that makes you look ghostly and corpse-like, even while you're still alive and conscious. This pale, greyish complexion is punctuated by bright red flush areas where your fever burns hottest, creating a mottled appearance that frightens family members and neighbours who see you in this condition. The contrast between pale and flushed areas gives your face a mask-like quality that makes you look more like a painted corpse than a living person. The weakness that began yesterday has progressed to the point where standing upright requires tremendous effort, and walking more than a few steps leaves you gasping for breath and trembling from exhaustion. Your muscles feel like they've been drained of all strength, as if the disease is consuming your body's resources and leaving nothing for normal function. Simple tasks like lifting a cup to your lips or adjusting your blankets become monumental challenges that require careful planning and conservation of energy. Sleep becomes increasingly elusive as your symptoms intensify and your body rebels against rest. The pain from your swollen lymph nodes makes it impossible to find a comfortable position, while the fever causes vivid, disturbing dreams when you do manage to drift off. These nightmares often involve themes of death and decay that seem to prophesy your fate, leaving you more disturbed and anxious when you wake than you were before attempting to sleep. Your family members begin to show signs of alarm as your condition deteriorates visibly, and your symptoms progress beyond what they recognise as normal illness. However, their understanding of disease is limited to folk remedies and superstitions, leaving them helpless to provide effective treatment for your condition. They may attempt to cool your fever with damp cloths, or brew herbal teas that they believe will help, but these well-meaning efforts provide little relief for the biological catastrophe occurring inside your body. The social isolation that will become a hallmark of plague victims begins as people start to notice your distinctive symptoms and begin to suspect that you might be suffering from something more serious than a common ailment. The visible swellings and your increasingly disturbing appearance cause neighbours and even family members to maintain greater distance from you, though they may not yet understand the contagious nature of your condition. Communication becomes increasingly difficult as the pain and fever affect your ability to think clearly and express yourself coherently. Words that once came easily now require tremendous effort to form, and even simple conversations leave you exhausted and confused. This mental deterioration adds another layer of terror to your experience, as you become aware that the disease is affecting not just your body but your mind as well. By the end of day 2, your condition has progressed to the point where survival becomes questionable, though you may still retain enough consciousness to understand what's happening to you. The full horror of your situation is beginning to become apparent, but the worst symptoms are still ahead, as your body continues its losing battle against one of history's most deadly diseases. Your third day with the Black Death marks the transformation from merely feeling sick to experiencing a medical horror that would challenge even modern medicine's ability to provide relief. The buboes that appeared as tender swellings yesterday have grown dramatically overnight, becoming massive egg-sized lumps that distort the normal contours of your body and cause excruciating pain with every movement or touch. These swollen lymph nodes have taken on an angry, inflamed appearance that makes them look like alien growths erupting from beneath your skin. The tissue surrounding each bubo has become hot, red, and stretched tight like a drum, while the surface skin has developed a shiny, almost translucent quality that reveals the dark, swollen mass beneath. The largest of these growths, typically located in your groin area, may be visible even through your clothing as an unnatural bulge that marks you as a plague victim. The pain emanating from these buboes has evolved beyond mere discomfort into an all-consuming agony that dominates every moment of your consciousness. Each heartbeat sends waves of throbbing pain through the affected areas, while any movement, no matter how slight, triggers sharp spikes of torture that force involuntary cries from your lips. The act of lying down becomes a careful choreography of positioning to avoid putting pressure on these inflammatory masses. Your fever has reached dangerous levels that cause delirium and hallucinations, making it difficult to distinguish between reality and the disturbing visions that plague your overheated mind. You may see people who aren't there, hear voices calling your name, or experience vivid scenes of death and decay that feel more real than your actual surroundings. These fever-induced hallucinations often incorporate religious imagery, as your medieval worldview interprets your suffering through the lens of divine punishment and spiritual torment. The skin around your buboes begins to show signs of breakdown as the intense inflammation underneath starts to affect the overlying tissue. What started as redness and heat progresses to areas of skin that become dark and mottled, taking on a purplish-black coloration that earned the plague its most famous name. These areas of darkened skin feel different to the touch, becoming tough and leathery as the tissue begins to die from the overwhelming infection. Breathing becomes increasingly laboured as your lungs begin to fill with fluid and your respiratory system struggles to function normally, despite the systemic infection ravaging your body. Each breath requires conscious effort, and you find yourself gasping for air like a fish out of water. The oxygen starvation caused by your failing lungs adds confusion and panic to your already overwhelming symptoms, creating a sense of drowning even while lying in your own bed. Your digestive system has essentially shut down, making it impossible to keep food or even water in your stomach for more than a few minutes before violent vomiting expels anything you attempt to consume. This inability to maintain nutrition or hydration accelerates your physical deterioration and adds dehydration to your growing list of life-threatening complications. The constant vomiting also increases the pain in your head and abdomen while further weakening your already compromised condition. The neurological effects of the plague become more pronounced as toxins from the massive infection begin to affect your brain function. Your ability to think clearly deteriorates rapidly, leaving you confused about basic facts like your location, the time of day, or the identity of family members attempting to care for you. This mental confusion is terrifying for both you and your loved ones, as they watch your personality and intellect dissolve along with your physical health. Speech becomes increasingly difficult as the infection affects your ability to control the muscles required for talking. Words that you want to say come out slurred and incomprehensible, while simple sentences require enormous effort to construct and deliver. This communication breakdown isolates you even further from the people around you, leaving you trapped inside a failing body with diminished ability to express your needs or fears. Your skin takes on an increasingly corpse-like appearance as your circulation fails and your body begins to shut down non-essential functions to preserve what little energy remains. The healthy pink colour of living skin gives way to a greyish pallor broken only by the angry red and black areas around your buboes. This death-like appearance often causes family members to begin mourning your loss, even while you still cling to life. The lymphatic system throughout your body becomes overwhelmed as additional lymph nodes begin to swell in response to the massive infection. Smaller buboes may appear in your wrists, behind your ears, or in other areas where lymph nodes exist, creating a constellation of painful swellings that make any movement torture. Your body's natural defense system has become a source of additional suffering as it struggles unsuccessfully to contain the bacterial invasion. Sleep becomes virtually impossible as the combination of pain, fever, and respiratory distress prevents any meaningful rest. When exhaustion finally forces brief periods of unconsciousness, you wake feeling worse than before, with no memory of having slept and no relief from the relentless progression of symptoms. The night hours stretch endlessly as you lie in agony, aware that each dawn brings you closer to death. Your family members begin to display their own early symptoms as the highly contagious nature of your disease spreads to those who have been caring for you. The same fever, headache, and malaise that marked your first day now appear in your loved ones, creating a household of increasingly sick people with diminishing ability to care for each other. The realization that your illness is spreading to others adds psychological torment to your physical suffering. The medieval understanding of medicine offers no effective treatments for your condition, leaving your family to attempt folk remedies that provide no relief and may actually worsen your suffering. They might try to lance your buboes with crude instruments, apply hot or cold compresses that increase your pain, or force herbal concoctions down your throat that your damaged digestive system immediately rejects. These well-meaning but futile efforts highlight the helplessness that defines the plague experience. By the end of day 3, your body has become a battlefield where the plague bacteria have established clear dominance over your natural defences. The distinctive symptoms that mark you as a plague victim are now unmistakable, and anyone who sees you recognises that you're suffering from the disease that has been devastating communities across Europe. Your survival has become increasingly unlikely as your condition continues its relentless progression toward the final stages of this medieval nightmare. Your 4th day with the Black Death brings the manifestation of the symptom that gave this medieval pandemic its most terrifying name, as your skin begins to develop the dark necrotic patches that mark the final stages of systemic bacterial infection. These areas of blackened tissue start small but spread rapidly across your body like ink stains, soaking through parchment, creating a mottled pattern of death that announces your doom to anyone who sees you. The process begins with small spots of darkened skin that appear around your buboes and in areas where blood circulation has been most severely compromised by the systemic infection. These patches start as deep, purple or dark red areas that feel different from normal skin, becoming cooler to the touch and less responsive to pressure. Within hours, these discoloured areas darken further, progressing through shades of brown and purple until they reach the characteristic black colour that earned the plague its most famous designation. The blackening skin represents tissue death on a massive scale, as the bacterial toxins and circulatory failure combine to kill entire sections of your body, while you remain conscious and aware of the transformation. This necrosis is irreversible and painless in the affected areas, creating an eerie sensation of numbness that contrasts sharply with the excruciating pain still emanating from your swollen lymph nodes. The boundary between living and dead tissue on your own body becomes a visible line that advances steadily as more of your flesh succumbs to the infection. Your buboes have reached their maximum size and may begin to rupture as the pressure from internal swelling exceeds the ability of your skin to contain the inflammatory mass. When these swellings burst, they release a foul-smelling mixture of pus, blood and necrotic tissue that stains your clothing and bedding, while filling the air with a sickly sweet odour of decay. The rupture provides no relief from pain, but instead creates open wounds that expose the horrific, internal damage caused by the plague bacteria. Breathing has become a desperate struggle as your lungs fill with fluid, and your respiratory system begins to fail under the assault of systemic infection. Each breath produces a distinctive rattling sound as air bubbles through the accumulating fluid in your chest, creating the death rattle that medieval people recognized as a sign of impending mortality. You gasp and wheeze like a drowning person, fighting for every breath while your oxygen-starved brain struggles to maintain consciousness. The fever that has tormented you for days now reaches levels that would be considered incompatible with life, cooking your brain and internal organs like food in an oven. Your body temperature soars beyond the ability of medieval medicine to measure, causing convulsions and seizures that shake your entire frame, and may cause you to bite your tongue or injure yourself against nearby objects. These hypothermia episodes alternate with periods of hypothermia as your body's temperature regulation system completely fails. Delirium has progressed to the point where you exist in a twilight world between reality and hallucination, unable to distinguish between what's actually happening and the fevered visions that fill your mind. You may believe you're in different locations, speaking to people who died years ago, or experiencing events that bear no relation to your current situation. This mental confusion is terrifying for family members who watch you respond to invisible stimuli and carry on conversations with people who aren't there. Your circulatory system begins to fail as the infection overwhelms your heart's ability to pump blood effectively throughout your body. Your pulse becomes weak and irregular, sometimes racing frantically as your heart struggles to compensate for the failing circulation, then dropping to barely detectable levels as the cardiac muscle becomes exhausted from the effort. This cardiovascular collapse accelerates the tissue death that creates the characteristic black patches on your skin. The kidney failure that often accompanies end-stage plague infection causes your body to retain toxins that would normally be filtered from your blood, adding uremic poisoning to your already overwhelming collection of symptoms. Your urine, if you're still able to produce any, becomes dark and concentrated, while waste products accumulate in your bloodstream and contribute to the confusion and seizures that mark your final days. Pain perception becomes altered as your nervous system succumbs to the massive infection, creating strange sensations where some areas of your body become completely numb, while others develop hypersensitivity that makes even gentle touches feel like burning needles. This neurological damage may cause phantom pains in areas where tissue has already died, creating the bizarre experience of feeling agony in parts of your body that are no longer alive, and your immune system has completely collapsed under the bacterial assault, leaving you vulnerable to secondary infections that your body can no longer fight off. These additional infections may affect your eyes, causing them to become cloudy and discharge pus, or attack your mouth and throat, creating ulcers and abscesses that make swallowing impossible. Every organ system in your body becomes a potential target for opportunistic infections that add to your suffering. The social isolation that began earlier in your illness now becomes complete, as even your closest family members recognize that approaching you means almost certain death. They may continue to provide basic care from a distance, but the intimate contact of earlier days gives way to fearful observation from across the room. This abandonment, though understandable given the circumstances, adds emotional trauma to your physical torment as you face death alone and abandoned. The distinctive odour of plague victims becomes overwhelming as your body begins to decay while you're still alive, creating a stench that permeates your dwelling and announces your condition to anyone who comes near. This smell, described by survivors as a combination of rotting meat and sickly sweet flowers, becomes so strong that it can be detected from considerable distances and serves as a warning to others about the presence of plague in your household. Medieval religious beliefs about death and divine punishment become prominent as your condition deteriorates, with family members and clergy interpreting your suffering as evidence of sin or spiritual corruption that requires confession and absolution. However, the physical reality of your condition often makes it impossible to participate in the religious rituals that might provide comfort, as you lack the ability to speak clearly or maintain consciousness for extended periods. By the end of day 4, your body has become a living demonstration of plague's devastating effects, with the characteristic blackened skin that gave the disease its name now clearly visible to anyone who observes your condition. Your survival has become extremely unlikely, as multiple organ systems fail simultaneously, and your body begins the process of dying, while your consciousness may still flicker in brief moments of awareness. Your 5th day with the Black Death represents the transition from severe illness to the actual process of dying, as your body begins to shut down systematically, while fragments of consciousness remain to witness the final stages of this medieval horror. The blackened areas of dead tissue have spread across significant portions of your body, creating a map of necrosis that demonstrates the plague's complete victory over your natural defences. The morning brings no relief from the nightmare of the previous days, only an intensification of symptoms that pushes your failing body closer to complete collapse. Your breathing has become so laboured and irregular that family members gather around your bedside, believing that each rattling breath might be your last. The sound emerging from your chest resembles the death rattle that medieval people recognised as the final warning of impending mortality. Your consciousness flickers in and out like a candle flame in a strong wind, with brief moments of awareness, alternating with periods of complete unconsciousness or delirium so profound that you seem to exist in an entirely different reality. During these lucid intervals, you may become aware of your surroundings and the desperate faces of family members hovering nearby. But these moments of clarity are often more terrifying than the delirium because they allow you to understand the full horror of what's happening to your body. The buboes that have tormented you for days have either ruptured completely, creating open wounds that drain constantly, or have become so large and tense that they threaten to burst at any moment. The skin around these swellings has taken on the appearance of rotting fruit, with areas of black and purple tissue that feel cold and lifeless to the touch. The smell emanating from these infected masses has become so overpowering that it drives people from your bedside and fills your dwelling with the unmistakable odour of death. Your circulatory system has failed to the point where your extremities no longer receive adequate blood flow, causing your fingers and toes to become cold, blue, and eventually black as the tissue dies from lack of oxygen and nutrients. This peripheral necrosis advances slowly but steadily toward your core, creating the appearance of a corpse that somehow retains the spark of life in its central organs, while the extremities have already begun the process of decay. Temperature regulation has become completely dysfunctional, with your body alternating between dangerous hypothermia that could cook your brain and hypothermia so severe that your core temperature drops below levels compatible with normal cellular function. These extreme temperature swings occur without warning and may happen multiple times within a single hour, creating additional stress on organ systems that are already functioning at the edge of complete failure. Your kidneys have essentially stopped working, causing your body to retain toxins and waste products that add confusion, seizures, and additional organ damage to your already overwhelming collection of symptoms. The uremic poisoning that results from kidney failure affects your brain function and may cause muscle twitching, nausea, and a metallic taste in your mouth that adds to the sensory nightmare you're experiencing. The cardiovascular collapse that began yesterday has progressed to the point where your heart struggles to maintain even minimal circulation, beating irregularly and weakly as the cardiac muscle becomes exhausted from days of fighting against overwhelming systemic infection. Your pulse may become so weak that it's barely detectable, while your blood pressure drops to levels that cannot sustain normal organ function. Respiratory failure creates the sensation of drowning in your own bed as fluid accumulates in your lungs and prevents adequate oxygen exchange. Each breath becomes a monumental effort that produces diminishing returns, leaving you gasping for air that provides no relief from the suffocating sensation. The fluid in your lungs creates a gurgling sound with each respiration that adds an auditory dimension to the horror of your condition. Your nervous system begins to shut down as bacterial toxins and oxygen deprivation affect brain function, causing seizures, muscle spasms, and periods of complete unconsciousness that may last for hours. These neurological symptoms are unpredictable and frightening, causing your body to convulse violently or become completely rigid while your family watches helplessly from nearby. The pain that has been your constant companion for days may begin to diminish as your nervous system becomes too damaged to transmit sensations effectively, creating an eerie numbness that spreads from the areas of dead tissue toward the parts of your body that still retain some semblance of life. This absence of pain might seem like a mercy, but it actually represents another step toward complete system failure. Your ability to swallow has disappeared entirely as the muscles controlling your throat become paralyzed by neurological damage and systemic infection. Any attempt to provide fluids results in choking and aspiration, while your mouth becomes dry and sticky as saliva production ceases. This inability to maintain hydration accelerates the final stages of organ failure, while creating additional discomfort for your remaining moments of consciousness. The visual changes in your appearance have become so dramatic that you no longer look recognizably human to the family members keeping vigil at your bedside. The combination of blackened skin, massive swellings, and the waxy pallor of approaching death transforms your features into something that frightens even those who love you most. Your eyes may become cloudy and unfocused, staring at nothing while reflecting no sign of the consciousness that occasionally flickers within. Medieval understanding of death recognizes that your condition has progressed beyond any possibility of recovery, and family members begin the process of preparing for your inevitable demise. However, the timing of death from plague is unpredictable, and you may linger in this state of living death for hours or even days while your body slowly completes the process of shutting down. The social and spiritual implications of plague death become prominent as religious authorities attempt to provide last rites and spiritual comfort, though the physical reality of your condition often makes traditional deathbed rituals impossible to perform. The fear of contagion may prevent clergy from approaching closely enough to provide the spiritual ministrations that medieval people consider essential for salvation. By the end of day 5, you exist in a liminal state between life and death, with your body clearly in the final stages of systemic failure, while some spark of consciousness may still remain to experience the horror of your transformation. The plague has achieved complete victory over your biological systems, and your death has become not a question of if, but when. Your 6th day with the Black Death marks the beginning of the final phase of your journey from life to death, as your body enters the terminal stages of systemic failure while maintaining just enough biological function to prolong your suffering. The process of dying from plague is neither quick nor merciful, instead dragging on for hours as your organs shut down one by one, while consciousness may flicker in and out like a dying flame. The morning finds you in a state that medieval observers would recognize as the immediate precursor to death, with your breathing becoming increasingly shallow and irregular as your respiratory system struggles to maintain even minimal function. The rattling sound that accompanies each breath has become more pronounced, creating an auditory announcement of your approaching demise that fills your dwelling with the unmistakable sound of impending mortality. Your circulation has failed to such an extent that large areas of your body have become cold and lifeless, while your core organs struggle to maintain the basic functions necessary for survival. Your skin has taken on the waxy, translucent appearance that medieval people associated with imminent death, while your extremities have become completely black and cold as blood flow ceases entirely to these non-essential areas. The buboes that have tortured you for days have either completely ruptured, creating gaping wounds that drain constantly, or have become so necrotic that the surrounding tissue begins to slough away in putrid masses. The infection that began in your lymph nodes has spread throughout your body, creating a systemic sepsis that overwhelms every remaining defense mechanism and pushes you toward inevitable death. Your consciousness has become fragmentary and unreliable, with brief moments of awareness separated by long periods of unconsciousness or delirium so profound that you seem to exist in a completely different reality. During these occasional lucid intervals, you may become aware of your surroundings and the people gathered around your bedside, but these moments of clarity are often more terrifying than beneficial because they allow you to understand the full horror of your situation. Temperature control has ceased entirely, with your body unable to maintain normal thermal regulation, as your metabolic processes begin to shut down. Your core temperature may fluctuate wildly or drop steadily toward ambient levels as your body prepares for the cessation of life. Family members may notice that your skin feels cold despite the fever that has tormented you for days, marking another milestone in your journey toward death. The cardiovascular collapse that began earlier has progressed to the point where your heart can barely maintain circulation to vital organs, beating weakly and irregularly as the cardiac muscle becomes exhausted from days of struggling against overwhelming infection. Your pulse becomes so faint that it may be difficult to detect, while your blood pressure drops below levels that can sustain consciousness or organ function. Neurological function deteriorates rapidly as bacterial toxins and oxygen deprivation cause irreversible damage to your brain tissue, resulting in seizures, muscle spasms, and periods of complete unresponsiveness that may last for hours. These neurological symptoms create a terrifying spectacle for family members who watch your body convulse or become completely rigid while your eyes roll back and your breathing becomes even more laboured. Your digestive system has shut down completely, with your stomach and intestines no longer able to process any substances that might be introduced. The accumulation of toxins and waste products in your system adds to the neurological symptoms while creating additional stress on organs that are already functioning at the edge of complete failure. Your abdomen may become distended and hard as your body's normal elimination processes cease. The immune system that failed to protect you from the initial infection has been completely destroyed by the bacterial assault, leaving your body vulnerable to secondary infections that add to your suffering during these final hours. Your mouth, eyes, and other mucous membranes may develop additional infections that create discharge and add to the already overwhelming odour of decay that surrounds your dying body. Pain perception becomes altered as your nervous system damage progresses, creating strange sensations where some areas become completely numb while others develop hypersensitivity that makes even gentle touches feel like torture. This neurological chaos may cause you to experience phantom pains in areas where tissue has already died, creating the bizarre sensation of feeling agony in parts of your body that are no longer alive. Your respiratory system enters the final phase of failure as fluid accumulation in your lungs reaches levels that make breathing nearly impossible, creating the sensation of drowning, while your respiratory system enters the final phase of failure as fluid accumulation in your lungs reaches levels that make breathing nearly impossible, creating the sensation of drowning while lying in your own bed. Each breath produces diminishing returns as your body struggles to extract oxygen from air that can barely penetrate the fluid-filled alveoli. The gurgling sound that accompanies each respiration becomes more pronounced and disturbing, creating an auditory countdown to your final moments. The kidney failure that began earlier has progressed to complete cessation of function, causing your body to retain all the toxins and waste products that would normally be filtered from your blood. This uremic poisoning affects every remaining organ system while contributing to the confusion, seizures, and muscle twitching that mark your final hours. Your body begins to poison itself with substances that accumulate because your natural filtration system has completely failed. Visual changes occur as your eyes become cloudy and unfocused, staring at nothing while reflecting no sign of the consciousness that may still flicker occasionally within your dying brain. Your pupils may become fixed and unresponsive to light, while the whites of your eyes take on a yellowish tinge that indicates the failure of multiple organ systems. Family members may notice that your gaze seems to look through them rather than at them, as if you are already seeing into another world. The social dynamics around your deathbed become complex as family members struggle between their desire to provide comfort and their fear of contracting the disease that has destroyed your body. Some may maintain a vigil from across the room, while others might risk closer contact to hold your hand or speak words of comfort during your final hours. The medieval understanding of death emphasizes the importance of dying surrounded by loved ones, but plague makes this traditional comfort dangerous for the living. Religious considerations become prominent as clergy attempt to provide last rites and spiritual comfort, though the physical reality of your condition often makes traditional deathbed rituals impossible to perform safely. The fear of contagion may prevent priests from approaching closely enough to administer the sacraments that medieval people consider essential for salvation, creating additional anxiety for family members who worry about the spiritual implications of dying without proper religious ministration. Your breathing pattern changes to what medical observers would recognize as Cheney-Stokes respiration, with periods of rapid, shallow breathing alternating with longer pauses where you seem to stop breathing entirely. These apneic episodes become longer and more frequent as your respiratory control center in the brain begins to fail, creating moments where family members believe you have died only to see you take another gasping breath. The final hours bring a strange mixture of agony and numbness, as your pain receptors become too damaged to transmit sensations effectively, while other parts of your nervous system continue to fire randomly, creating phantom pains and strange sensations that add to the nightmare of your dying experience. You may feel like you're burning or freezing, floating or falling, as your brain struggles to interpret signals from a body that is rapidly ceasing to function. By the end of day 6, your body has entered the active process of dying, with multiple organ systems shutting down simultaneously, while some spark of life still remains to experience the final stages of this medieval horror. The plague has achieved total victory over your biological systems, and your death becomes an inevitable conclusion to a week-long journey through humanity's darkest pandemic. Your 7th day with the Black Death brings the final cessation of life, as your body completes the process of dying that began a week ago with seemingly innocent symptoms. The transition from life to death is not instantaneous, but rather a gradual shutdown of biological functions that may take hours to complete, during which consciousness may flicker in and out like a candle flame struggling against an overwhelming wind. The morning hours bring the final phase of respiratory failure, as your lungs become so filled with fluid that breathing becomes impossible, despite your body's desperate attempts to maintain oxygen flow. Your chest rises and falls irregularly, with long pauses between breaths that grow progressively longer, until the final breath comes and goes without notice. The death rattle that has accompanied your breathing for days gradually fades into silence as your respiratory system surrenders to the inevitable. Your heart, exhausted from days of struggling against overwhelming infection and circulatory collapse, begins to beat irregularly before finally stopping entirely. The cardiovascular failure is not dramatic, but rather a quiet cessation of function, as the cardiac muscle simply lacks the energy to continue contracting. Your pulse, already weak and thready, becomes undetectable as circulation ceases and your blood begins the process of settling into the lowest parts of your body. The neurological shutdown that has been progressing for days reaches completion as your brain ceases to function due to oxygen deprivation and bacterial toxin damage. Any remaining consciousness disappears as the electrical activity in your brain diminishes and finally stops entirely. The seizures and muscle spasms that have tormented your final days give way to complete stillness as your nervous system joins the growing list of failed organ systems. Your kidneys, liver, and other vital organs complete their shutdown process as cellular death spreads throughout your body like a wave of biological failure. The toxins that have been accumulating due to organ dysfunction are no longer being processed or eliminated. But this becomes irrelevant as the need for metabolic function disappears with the cessation of life. The moment of death itself may be difficult to determine precisely, as the various biological functions that define life shut down at slightly different times, rather than ceasing simultaneously. Medieval observers might notice that breathing has stopped but continue to watch for other signs of life before concluding that death has actually occurred. The transition from living person to corpse is a process rather than an instantaneous event. Your body begins the immediate post-mortem changes that medieval people would recognize as confirmation of death, including the relaxation of muscles that had been tense with pain and struggle, the pooling of blood in dependent areas that creates a mottled appearance, and the beginning of the cooling process that will eventually bring your body temperature to match the surrounding environment. The family members who have maintained a vigil during your final hours must now confront the reality of your death, while simultaneously dealing with the practical challenges of disposing of your plague-contaminated corpse. The fear of contagion that kept people at a distance during your illness becomes even more pronounced after death, as medieval understanding suggests that plague victims remain dangerous even after life has ended. The process of preparing your body for burial becomes a dangerous task that few people are willing to undertake, given the belief that handling plague corpses can transmit the disease to the living. Your family may be forced to wrap your body in whatever cloth is available and arrange for disposal without the traditional washing and preparation rituals that normally accompany death in medieval society. The social implications of dying from plague extend beyond the immediate family to affect the entire community, as your death serves as a warning of the disease's presence and may trigger panic or flight among neighbours who fear they might be next. The house where you died may be avoided or even abandoned entirely as people attempt to distance themselves from the contamination they believe lingers in places where plague victims have lived and died. Religious authorities face difficult decisions about providing proper funeral rites for plague victims, as the traditional ceremonies require close contact with the corpse and gathering of community members in ways that could spread the disease. Many plague deaths result in hasty burials without full religious observances, creating additional trauma for surviving family members who worry about the spiritual implications of inadequate funeral rites. The disposal of your body becomes a practical challenge that reflects the breakdown of normal social systems during plague outbreaks. Traditional burial grounds may be overwhelmed by the number of deaths, while gravediggers may refuse to handle plague corpses due to fear of contagion. Your body might be disposed of in mass graves with other plague victims, or in some cases, simply abandoned if no one is willing or able to arrange for proper burial. The economic impact of your death affects your family's survival prospects, as the loss of your labour and income-generating capacity may push surviving family members towards starvation or destitution. The disruption of normal economic activity during plague outbreaks means that usual support systems may not be available to help your family cope with the financial consequences of your death. The psychological trauma experienced by family members who witnessed your suffering and death creates lasting damage that affects survivors for years after the plague passes. The horror of watching a loved one die from plague, combined with the fear of contracting the disease themselves, creates mental health problems that medieval society has no effective ways to address or treat. The contagious nature of plague means that your death may be followed by the illness and death of family members who cared for you during your final days, creating a cascade of mortality that can destroy entire households within weeks. The incubation period of the disease means that people who appeared healthy at the time of your death may already be infected and destined to follow the same path of suffering and death. The broader social impact of plague deaths like yours contributes to the breakdown of normal community functions, as increasing numbers of people die and survivors flee to escape the disease. The accumulation of individual deaths creates ghost towns and abandoned regions where normal human activity ceases entirely, leaving behind only empty buildings and unburied corpses as testimony to the plague's devastating impact. Your death represents not just the end of one person's life, but a single data point in humanity's most devastating pandemic, which killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population and fundamentally changed the course of medieval civilization. The personal horror of your 7-day journey from health to death was repeated millions of times across Europe, creating a collective trauma that shaped the medieval worldview and influenced European culture for centuries to come. Your family's desperate attempts to find medical help during your illness bring them into contact with the medieval physicians, whose training and understanding of disease prove utterly inadequate for treating the Black Death. These learned men, educated in the medical theories inherited from ancient Greek and Roman sources, approach your condition with confidence in their knowledge that will quickly dissolve into horrified bewilderment as they witness symptoms that challenge everything they believe about illness and healing. The physician who arrives at your dwelling comes equipped with the standard medical knowledge of the 14th century, which attributes disease to imbalances in the 4 bodily humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. His initial examination focuses on determining which humours are out of balance in your body, using techniques like examining your urine colour, feeling your pulse, and observing your general appearance to diagnose what he assumes must be a conventional illness requiring traditional treatments. The first sight of your condition immediately challenges the physician's understanding, as your symptoms don't match any disease described in the classical medical texts that form the foundation of his education. The massive buboes swelling in your lymph nodes, the blackening skin, and the rapid progression of symptoms create a clinical picture that defies explanation according to the humoral theory that guides medieval medical practice. The physician's attempts at treatment follow the standard approaches taught in medieval medical schools, beginning with bloodletting to remove excess blood that he believes might be causing your fever and inflammation. Using crude lancets or primitive cutting tools, he opens veins in your arms or applies leeches to various parts of your body, believing that draining blood will restore the proper balance of humours and cure your condition. The bloodletting procedures, performed with unsterilised instruments in unsanitary conditions, actually worsen your condition by introducing additional infections while weakening your body's already compromised ability to fight the plague bacteria. The physician may remove significant quantities of blood, believing that more dramatic intervention will produce better results, but instead accelerating your decline toward death while providing no therapeutic benefit. Purging becomes the next line of treatment as the physician attempts to eliminate what he believes are corrupt humours through violent vomiting and diarrhoea. He administers powerful emetics and laxatives that cause additional trauma to your already failing digestive system while dehydrating your body and depleting essential nutrients. These treatments leave you weaker and more vulnerable to the plague's effects, while providing no relief from your actual symptoms. The physician's pharmaceutical arsenal consists of herbal remedies and mineral preparations that have no effect on bacterial infections, but may introduce additional toxins into your already overwhelmed system. Common treatments include mercury compounds, lead-based preparations, and various plant extracts that cause poisoning symptoms on top of your existing plague manifestations, creating additional suffering without therapeutic benefit. Astrological considerations play a major role in the physician's treatment decisions, as medieval medicine attributes disease causation to unfavourable planetary alignments and celestial influences. The timing of treatments, the selection of medications, and even the prognosis for your condition are influenced by astrological calculations that have no bearing on the bacterial infection destroying your body, but may delay or misdirect therapeutic efforts. The concept of contagion is poorly understood in medieval medicine, leading physicians to expose themselves repeatedly to plague patients without taking protective measures that might prevent disease transmission. Many physicians contract the plague from their patients and die themselves, creating a shortage of medical practitioners just when they are most needed, and demonstrating the inadequacy of medieval medical knowledge. Religious explanations for disease become prominent when medical treatments fail, with physicians attributing your condition to divine punishment for sin or spiritual corruption that requires confession and absolution rather than medical intervention. This shift from medical to religious interpretation reflects the physician's inability to explain or treat your condition using the scientific knowledge available in the 14th century. The physician's observations of plague symptoms contribute to the growing medical literature about the disease, but without understanding of bacterial causation or effective treatments, these clinical descriptions serve mainly to document the horror rather than guide therapeutic intervention. Medical texts from the plague years describe symptoms in accurate detail while offering treatments that are ineffective or harmful. The psychological impact on physicians who witness plague patients creates lasting trauma for medical practitioners who watch their patients die despite their best efforts to provide care. The complete failure of conventional medical treatments challenges fundamental beliefs about disease and healing, while creating doubt about the value of medical education and practice. Surgical interventions attempted by some physicians include efforts to lance or drain the buboes that characterize plague infection, but these procedures performed with primitive instruments in unsanitary conditions typically introduce additional infections while providing no therapeutic benefit. The surgical treatment of buboes often accelerates the patient's death, while creating additional suffering during the final stages of illness. The economic aspects of medical care during plague outbreaks become complicated as physicians demand higher fees for treating plague patients, while often being unable to provide effective treatment. Families may exhaust their financial resources paying for medical care that proves worthless, leaving survivors impoverished as well as bereaved, while contributing to the economic disruption caused by the pandemic. The social status of physicians suffers during plague outbreaks, as their inability to treat the disease effectively becomes apparent to the general population. The traditional respect accorded to learned medical practitioners diminishes as people observe that physicians die from plague at the same rate as their patients, demonstrating that medical knowledge provides no protection against the disease. The training of new physicians becomes disrupted during plague years as medical schools close and experienced practitioners die, creating a generation of medical practitioners with even less knowledge and experience than their predecessors. The discontinuity in medical education contributes to the long-term impact of plague on European medical development. Alternative medical practitioners, including folk healers, herbalists, and religious healers, gain prominence as people lose confidence in conventional physicians and seek help from anyone who claims to offer effective treatments. These alternative practitioners typically have even less understanding of disease than trained physicians, but may provide psychological comfort to patients and families who feel abandoned by conventional medicine. The documentation of medical failures during plague outbreaks becomes part of the historical record, providing modern researchers with detailed accounts of medieval medical practice, while demonstrating the complete inadequacy of 14th century medical knowledge to address a bacterial pandemic. These medical records serve as testimony to human suffering during one of history's most devastating disease outbreaks. Your family's request for spiritual comfort during your final days brings a priest to your dwelling, where he must confront the theological and practical challenges of providing religious ministration to plague victims while risking his own life in service to his pastoral duties. The medieval priest arrives carrying the weight of both spiritual responsibility and mortal fear. Knowing that approaching plague victims has killed many of his clerical colleagues, but believing that dying souls require spiritual care regardless of the danger. The priest's theological understanding of plague reflects the medieval worldview that interprets disease as divine punishment for sin, either individual moral failings or collective corruption that has angered God and brought catastrophe upon the community. His approach to your condition involves determining what sins might have caused your illness, while attempting to provide the spiritual remedies that medieval Christianity prescribes for moral and physical healing. The sacrament of confession becomes critically important as the priest believes that spiritual purification through acknowledgement and absolution of sins may provide the only hope for your recovery, or at least ensure your salvation after death. However, your deteriorated condition makes meaningful confession difficult or impossible, as delirium and respiratory failure prevent coherent communication about your spiritual state. The administration of last rites requires close physical contact that puts the priest at extreme risk of contracting plague, but medieval theology emphasizes that dying souls must receive these final sacraments to ensure salvation. The priest must choose between his own survival and his spiritual obligations to provide comfort and religious support to dying parishioners, a choice that many clergy resolve by accepting martyrdom in service to their pastoral duties. The psychological burden on priests during plague outbreaks becomes overwhelming as they witness unprecedented numbers of deaths, while being unable to provide effective spiritual comfort to the dying or meaningful consolation to the survivors. The sheer volume of death during plague years exceeds the capacity of individual priests to provide adequate spiritual care, leading to rushed ceremonies and abbreviated rituals that may feel inadequate to grieving families. The shortage of clergy during plague outbreaks occurs as priests die from the disease at high rates, due to their close contact with infected patients, creating a crisis of spiritual leadership just when communities most need religious guidance and comfort. The death of experienced clergy also eliminates the institutional knowledge about conducting religious services and maintaining church operations during times of crisis. The theological questions raised by plague challenge fundamental religious beliefs about divine justice and mercy, as the seemingly random nature of plague deaths affects righteous and sinful people equally while sparing some individuals who appear morally corrupt. Priests struggle to explain why God would allow such massive suffering while maintaining faith in divine benevolence and justice. The practical challenges of conducting religious services during plague outbreaks include the difficulty of gathering congregations when people fear contagion from close contact with others, the shortage of clergy to conduct services, and the overwhelming number of deaths that require funeral rites. Churches may close entirely during severe outbreaks, leaving communities without spiritual support during their time of greatest need. Funeral practices require modification during plague years, as traditional ceremonies involving close contact with corpses and gathering of mourners become dangerous sources of disease transmission. Priests must develop abbreviated burial rites that can be performed quickly and with minimal contact while still providing spiritual comfort to grieving families and ensuring proper religious observance for the dead. The economic impact on religious institutions includes the loss of financial support as parishioners die or flee plague-affected areas, while the costs of providing increased spiritual services during the crisis strain church resources. Many churches face financial collapse during plague years as their economic foundation disappears along with their congregation. The social role of priests expands during plague outbreaks as clergy become responsible for organising community responses to the crisis, including coordinating care for orphans, distributing charity to destitute families, and maintaining civil order when secular authorities become overwhelmed or absent. This expansion of responsibilities often exceeds the capabilities of reduced clerical personnel. The spiritual counselling provided by priests during plague must address not only the fears of dying patients, but also the trauma experienced by survivors who witness massive death and social collapse. The psychological support required exceeds traditional pastoral training and experience, as priests encounter levels of human suffering and social disruption that challenge conventional religious explanations and comfort. The preservation of religious records becomes difficult during plague years, as churches lose personnel and organisational capacity while the volume of deaths overwhelms record-keeping systems. Many religious documents from plague years are incomplete or missing entirely, reflecting the chaos that affected all institutions during the pandemic. The training of new clergy becomes disrupted as seminaries close and experienced priests die, creating a shortage of qualified religious personnel that persists long after the plague passes. The theological education that prepares priests for normal pastoral duties proves inadequate for the extreme challenges posed by pandemic conditions. The interfaith relationships that exist in medieval communities become strained during plague outbreaks, as different religious groups blame each other for causing divine punishment, while competing for scarce resources and seeking scapegoats for the disaster. Priests must navigate these religious tensions while attempting to maintain social cohesion and prevent violence against minority communities. The personal faith of individual priests may be tested by their experiences during plague outbreaks, as witnessing massive suffering and death challenges beliefs about divine justice and protection, while the apparent randomness of plague mortality calls into question traditional explanations about divine reward and punishment. Some clergy lose their faith entirely, while others develop more nuanced theological understanding that incorporates the reality of meaningless suffering. The long-term impact on religious institutions includes changes in theological emphasis toward individual piety and salvation, rather than community-based religious practice, as plague survivors develop more personal and immediate relationships with divine authority. The massive mortality among clergy also creates opportunities for rapid advancement of surviving priests, leading to inexperienced religious leadership in the post-plague period. Your neighbourhood merchant who has travelled the trade routes connecting medieval Europe with Asia and Africa becomes an unwitting agent in the spread of plague as his commercial activities create the pathways through which the disease travels from community to community. His story illustrates how the very economic systems that create prosperity and cultural exchange in the medieval world also serve as highways for one of history's most devastating pandemics that will reshape the foundations of international commerce and forever alter humanity's relationship with global trade. The merchant's business involves importing goods from distant lands where plague has already established itself, unknowingly carrying infected fleas and contaminated materials that introduce the disease to previously unaffected areas. His ships, wagons and pack animals serve as vehicles for plague transmission, while his trade goods provide hiding places for the rodents and insects that carry the bacteria responsible for the Black Death. Every bolt of silk from China, every sack of spices from India, every barrel of wine from distant vineyards becomes a potential vessel of death, carrying microscopic passengers that will devastate entire civilizations with methodical efficiency. The merchant's typical trading expedition begins in his home city, where he loads his vessel with local goods destined for foreign markets, unaware that his cargo holds already harbour the rats and fleas that have infested the warehouses where his merchandise was stored. These storage facilities, built along busy waterfronts and trade routes, provide ideal breeding grounds for rodent populations that multiply in the abundant food supplies and create dense colonies that incubate plague bacteria while remaining invisible to merchants focused on their commercial activities. The loading process involves dozens of workers who handle contaminated goods while transferring cargo between storage areas and transport vessels, creating multiple opportunities for disease transmission as infected fleas abandon dying rats to seek new hosts among the human population. The stevedores and dock workers who move cargo through busy ports unknowingly spread plague bacteria through their clothing and personal effects while carrying the disease home to their families and communities at the end of each working day. The merchant ship itself becomes a floating laboratory for plague transmission, as the confined space of the vessel creates ideal conditions for disease spread among crew members who live in close quarters for weeks or months during long trading voyages. The ship's hold, filled with grain supplies and trade goods that attract rats, becomes a breeding ground for rodent populations that multiply during the voyage, while developing massive flea infestations that eventually seek human hosts when rat populations become too depleted to sustain them. The crew members who tend the ship's operations become infected through contact with contaminated cargo areas and through flea bites from insects that emerge from the hold, seeking blood meals from human hosts. The confined nature of shipboard life ensures rapid disease transmission among crew members, while the isolated environment of ocean travel prevents access to medical care or emergency assistance that might be available on land. The merchants' trading partners in distant ports often represent the first human contact between plague-infected vessels and previously unaffected populations, creating introduction points where the disease establishes footholds in new geographic regions before spreading through local trade networks and population centres. These commercial relationships that normally represent mutual benefit and cultural exchange become pathways for biological warfare as unknowing merchants carry death to their trusted business associates. The early signs of plague in commercial centres manifest as unexplained deaths among dock workers, warehouse personnel, and other individuals who handle imported merchandise. But these initial cases are often attributed to other causes until the characteristic symptoms become widespread enough to be recognised as plague. The merchant community initially resists acknowledging the connection between trade and disease transmission, because accepting this reality would require shutting down the commercial activities that support their livelihoods and destroy the economic relationships that have taken decades to establish. The first deaths among port workers are typically dismissed as accidents, food poisoning, or seasonal illnesses that commonly affect people engaged in physically demanding labour under unsanitary conditions. The dock workers who load and unload cargo live in poverty conditions that already expose them to various health risks, making it easy to attribute initial plague deaths to existing health problems, rather than recognising them as symptoms of a new and deadly disease. The warehouse managers and cargo handlers who supervise the storage and distribution of imported goods represent the next wave of plague transmission as they come into contact with contaminated materials while organising inventory and preparing shipments for local distribution. These supervisory personnel often have broader social contacts than common labourers, creating additional pathways for disease transmission into merchant families and commercial networks. The customs officials and trade inspectors who examine imported goods for tax assessment purposes unknowingly expose themselves to plague bacteria while handling contaminated merchandise, then carry the disease to government offices and administrative centres where it spreads through bureaucratic networks. The official inspection process that ensures proper taxation of trade goods also ensures systematic exposure of government personnel to plague contamination. The transportation workers who move goods from ports to inland markets create additional transmission pathways as they carry contaminated cargo along established trade routes, while stopping at inns, markets, and rest stations that serve as distribution points for disease transmission. The teamsters and wagon drivers who transport goods spend weeks travelling between communities, creating opportunities for plague spread across vast geographic areas. The economic calculations that drive medieval commerce create incentives for merchants to continue trading, even after plague appears in their supply chains, as the financial losses from halting business operations often seem more immediate and certain than the health risks posed by continuing trade relationships with infected areas. The competitive nature of medieval commerce means that merchants who voluntarily cease trading may lose market share to rivals who continue operations despite the health risks, creating economic pressure to maintain dangerous business practices. The merchant's financial obligations include loan payments, contractual commitments, and family support requirements that cannot be postponed without risking bankruptcy and social ruin, making it economically impossible to voluntarily cease trading activities even when plague risks become apparent. The debt relationships that finance medieval commerce create binding obligations that force continued business activity regardless of health risks, as defaulting on commercial loans results in immediate financial catastrophe, while plague risks seem theoretical and distant. The competitive marketplace that characterises medieval trade creates situations where merchants who refuse to handle potentially contaminated goods lose business to competitors who are willing to accept these risks in exchange for profit opportunities. The fear of losing market share to less scrupulous rivals forces even cautious merchants to continue dangerous trading practices, while hoping that plague risks can be managed through careful handling procedures that prove entirely inadequate. The insurance and risk management systems available to medieval merchants provide no protection against plague losses, forcing individual traders to absorb the full cost of business disruption when plague affects their operations. The absence of risk-sharing mechanisms means that plague-related losses can destroy merchant families completely, while the unpredictable nature of plague transmission makes it impossible to calculate reasonable risk premiums that would make insurance feasible. The partnership arrangements that finance large trading ventures create shared liability for plague-related losses, while distributing decision-making authority among multiple partners who may disagree about appropriate responses to plague risks. The complex financial relationships that enable international commerce become sources of conflict when plague forces difficult decisions about continuing dangerous trading activities versus accepting certain financial losses. The social responsibility of merchants during plague outbreaks becomes a complex ethical question, as their specialized knowledge about trade routes and disease patterns gives them information that could help communities prepare for or prevent plague transmission, but sharing this information might also destroy their business relationships and economic prospects. The tension between individual profit and community welfare becomes acute when merchant decisions directly affect public health outcomes for entire populations. The merchant's unique position as an international traveller provides him with information about plague outbreaks in distant regions that could help local communities prepare for disease arrival. But sharing this intelligence might create panic that disrupts business relationships and eliminates trading opportunities. The early warning that merchants could provide about approaching plague represents valuable public health information, but revealing this information might also trigger economic responses that destroy merchant livelihoods. The ethical dilemma facing plague-aware merchants involves choosing between personal financial survival and community welfare when these interests conflict directly, as warning communities about plague risks might prevent disease transmission but also eliminate the trading relationships that support merchant families. The moral obligation to protect innocent people conflicts with the practical necessity of maintaining economic relationships that ensure family survival. The religious and cultural expectations that govern merchant behaviour emphasise community responsibility and mutual aid, but these social obligations become complicated when fulfilling them requires financial sacrifice that threatens family survival. The medieval moral framework that guides merchant conduct provides unclear guidance for situations where personal survival conflicts with community welfare in life and death decisions. The legal frameworks that govern commercial activity provide no guidance for merchant responsibilities during health emergencies, leaving individual traders to make ethical decisions without clear social or legal standards about appropriate behaviour during pandemic conditions. The absence of legal precedent for plague-related commercial disruption means that merchants must navigate unprecedented ethical terrain without institutional support or guidance. The international nature of medieval trade means that plague spreads along established commercial networks much faster than it would through random population movement, creating a pattern of disease transmission that follows economic relationships rather than geographical proximity. Cities and regions that are major commercial centres experience earlier and more severe plague outbreaks than isolated areas with limited trade connections, demonstrating how economic integration amplifies pandemic impact through systematic disease distribution. The speed of plague transmission through commercial networks exceeds natural disease spread by orders of magnitude, as infected goods and travellers can traverse vast distances in weeks, while carrying plague bacteria to distant regions that would otherwise require months or years for disease arrival. The acceleration of pandemics spread through trade networks collapses the natural barriers of time and distance that might otherwise limit disease impact. The commercial routes that connect major trading centres create superhighways for plague transmission that bypass natural geographical barriers, including mountains, rivers, and political boundaries that might otherwise slow disease spread. The established pathways of international commerce provide efficient distribution networks for plague bacteria that exploit human economic relationships to achieve maximum transmission efficiency. The trading seasons that govern commercial activity create temporal patterns in plague transmission, as increased trade volume during peak seasons accelerates disease spread, while seasonal trading lulls provide brief respites that may allow communities to implement containment measures. The cyclical nature of medieval commerce creates predictable windows of vulnerability when increased trade activity maximizes plague transmission opportunities. The commodity flows that characterize international trade create specific transmission pathways for plague bacteria, as certain types of goods provide better harboring conditions for infected rodents and fleas. Grain shipments, textile goods, and other materials that attract rodents or provide hiding places for insects become preferred transmission vectors that carry plague more effectively than other types of cargo. The practical challenges faced by merchants during plague years include the disruption of supply chains as producers, transporters, and customers die or abandon their business activities, creating shortages of essential goods while simultaneously reducing demand for luxury items that form the basis of long-distance trade. The economic foundation of merchant activity collapses as both supply and demand sides of commercial relationships are devastated by plague mortality, creating business conditions that make normal commerce impossible. The production disruptions that occur when plague affects manufacturing centres eliminate the supply of goods that form the basis of international trade, forcing merchants to find alternative sources or abandon certain product lines entirely. The craftsmen and artisans who produce trade goods die from plague or flee affected areas, creating supply shortages that cannot be resolved through normal commercial channels. The transportation networks that connect production centres with markets become unreliable when plague affects the workers who maintain roads, bridges, and other infrastructure essential for commercial travel. The teamsters, ship crews, and other transportation workers who move goods between regions die from plague or refuse to travel through affected areas, creating logistics problems that prevent normal trade operations. The market demand for luxury goods that supports long-distance trade collapses when plague mortality reduces the customer base, while survivors focus their spending on essential items rather than imported luxuries. The wealthy customers who normally purchase expensive imported goods die from plague or redirect their resources toward survival needs, eliminating the profit margins that make international commerce viable. The financial systems that support commercial credit and currency exchange become unreliable when plague affects the banking and financial personnel who manage commercial transactions. The money changers and credit providers who facilitate international trade die from plague or abandon their businesses, creating payment problems that disrupt established commercial relationships. The personal risk faced by travelling merchants who continue their business activities during plague outbreaks is extremely high, as their occupation requires them to visit multiple communities and handle goods that may be contaminated with plague bacteria. Many merchants die from plague contracted during their business travels, while others abandon their trade activities to avoid exposure to the disease, creating a shortage of experienced traders that further disrupts commercial networks. The merchant's daily activities during plague years involve constant exposure to potential contamination, as he handles goods that may harbour infected fleas, visits warehouses and markets where plague transmission occurs, and interacts with people who may be incubating the disease. The routine business activities that define merchant occupation become high-risk behaviours that dramatically increase plague infection probability. The travel requirements that characterise merchant occupation force continued exposure to plague risks, as business success depends on visiting multiple communities where disease transmission occurs, staying in accommodations that may harbour infected rodents, and eating food that may be contaminated with plague bacteria. The mobility that makes merchants valuable as traders also makes them vulnerable to plague infection and effective vectors for disease transmission. The social interactions that form the basis of merchant business relationships require close personal contact with trading partners, customers, and suppliers who may be infected with plague, creating business obligations that conflict directly with disease avoidance strategies. The trust relationships that support commercial transactions become sources of plague transmission when business meetings and negotiations require proximity to potentially infected individuals. The handling of contaminated goods that may harbour plague bacteria becomes unavoidable when merchants must inspect, transport, and deliver trade items that serve as vectors for disease transmission. The quality control and inventory management that ensure successful commerce require direct contact with goods that may be contaminated, making plague exposure an occupational hazard that cannot be eliminated through careful procedures. The regulatory responses to plague transmission through trade include attempts by local authorities to quarantine incoming goods, restrict travel by merchants, or prohibit trade with affected areas. But these measures are often ineffective because of limited understanding of disease transmission and the practical difficulties of enforcing trade restrictions across medieval political boundaries. The government interventions that attempt to prevent plague spread through commercial channels often prove inadequate while creating additional economic disruption. The quarantine procedures implemented by local authorities typically involve isolating incoming ships and cargo for specified periods before allowing unloading. But these measures prove ineffective because plague bacteria can survive longer than quarantine periods, while infected fleas may not show symptoms immediately. The quarantine systems that seem reasonable, based on medieval medical understanding, fail to prevent plague transmission because they are based on incorrect assumptions about disease mechanisms. The travel restrictions imposed on merchants attempt to prevent plague spread by limiting movement between communities, but these measures prove unenforceable because of the porous nature of medieval political boundaries and the economic incentives that encourage merchants to evade travel bans. The regulatory systems that govern medieval commerce lack the administrative capacity to monitor and control merchant movement effectively. The trade prohibitions that ban commerce with plague-affected regions attempt to prevent disease transmission by eliminating commercial contact, but these measures often prove counterproductive because they create economic incentives for illegal trade that occurs without regulatory oversight or safety precautions. The black market commerce that develops in response to trade bans increases plague transmission risks while eliminating the regulatory protections that might reduce contamination. The enforcement mechanisms available to medieval authorities prove inadequate for implementing effective trade restrictions because of limited administrative capacity, corruption among enforcement personnel, and the economic interests that motivate merchants to evade regulations. The regulatory systems that might prevent plague transmission through commerce lack the institutional capability to implement and maintain effective controls. The financial impact of plague on merchant families includes the loss of business assets when trade operations must be abandoned, the costs of medical care for infected family members, and the destruction of credit relationships when business partners die or become unable to fulfill their commercial obligations. Many merchant families face financial ruin even if they survive the plague physically, creating long-term economic consequences that extend far beyond the immediate health impact of the disease. The merchant's capital investments in ships, warehouses, and trade goods become worthless when plague disrupts commercial operations, while the specialized knowledge and business relationships that represent merchant wealth cannot be easily transferred to other occupations. The assets that define merchant prosperity become liabilities during plague years when commercial activity becomes impossible and trade goods may harbour deadly contamination. The credit relationships that finance merchant operations become unreliable when plague affects the lenders and borrowers who participate in commercial finance, creating debt obligations that cannot be fulfilled and loan agreements that become impossible to enforce. The financial networks that support international commerce collapse when plague mortality eliminates the personnel who manage credit relationships and maintain financial records. The partnership arrangements that pool merchant resources for large trading ventures become complicated when plague affects partners differently, creating disputes about risk allocation and profit distribution when business operations become impossible. The shared financial obligations that enable international commerce become sources of conflict when plague prevents normal business activity, while creating unequal burdens among surviving partners. The insurance and risk management systems that protect merchant investments prove inadequate for plague-related losses because medieval financial instruments cannot account for the unprecedented scale of economic disruption caused by pandemic disease. The risk assessment methods that guide commercial insurance prove useless when plague creates losses that exceed all historical precedent. The social status of merchants in plague-affected communities often deteriorates as people blame trade activities for introducing the disease, leading to hostility and violence against merchant families who are viewed as responsible for community suffering. The cosmopolitan lifestyle that previously gave merchants social prestige becomes a liability when international connections are seen as sources of contamination, forcing merchant families to hide their commercial activities or face social ostracism and physical danger. The merchant's previous social position as a respected community member who brings exotic goods and news from distant lands transforms into suspicion and hostility when people recognise the connection between trade activities and plague transmission. The social capital that merchants accumulated through their international connections becomes a liability when these same connections are viewed as pathways for disease introduction. The violence directed against merchant families often includes property destruction, physical assault, and forced exile from communities that blame merchants for plague mortality, creating additional losses beyond the direct economic impact of business disruption. The social persecution that merchants face during plague years may prove more devastating than the financial losses, as it eliminates the community relationships that support both personal welfare and business operations. The scapegoating behaviour that targets merchants for plague responsibility reflects community need to blame identifiable individuals for catastrophic losses that seem otherwise inexplicable, creating persecution that may continue long after plague mortality subsides. The merchant families who survive plague physically may face decades of social hostility and economic discrimination that prevents business recovery. The protection mechanisms available to merchant families during periods of social persecution prove inadequate because local authorities may share community hostility toward merchants while lacking the power to protect unpopular groups from mob violence. The legal systems that normally protect merchant interests become unreliable when merchants are viewed as threats to community welfare. The information networks that merchants maintain across their trade routes provide some of the most accurate contemporary accounts of plague's geographic spread and demographic impact. As commercial correspondence documents the progression of the disease through different regions and the collapse of business activities in affected areas. These merchant records often provide more reliable information about plague than official governmental or religious sources, because commercial success depends on accurate intelligence about conditions in distant markets. The merchant's correspondence with trading partners creates a documentation system that tracks plague progression across vast geographic areas while recording the economic and social impact of disease transmission on commercial activities. The business letters that coordinate trade operations inadvertently create historical records that provide detailed information about plague chronology and geographic distribution. The commercial intelligence that merchants gather about market conditions necessarily includes information about plague outbreaks that affect trade opportunities, creating reports that document disease impact with greater accuracy than official government sources. The economic motivation that drives merchant information gathering ensures systematic data collection about plague effects that might otherwise go unrecorded. The trading partner networks that connect merchants across international boundaries create communication systems that transmit information about plague outbreaks faster and more accurately than official diplomatic channels. The business relationships that support commerce also support information exchange that provides early warning about plague arrival and detailed reports about disease progression. The record-keeping systems that merchants maintain for business purposes inadvertently create historical documentation about plague impact that proves more comprehensive and accurate than contemporary government or religious records. The commercial documents that track trade operations preserve detailed information about plague chronology and demographic impact that serves modern researchers studying medieval pandemic history. The long-term changes in commercial practices resulting from plague experience include the development of quarantine procedures for ships and goods, changes in trade route preferences that avoid areas with history of plague outbreaks, and modifications in commercial law that address the disruption of contracts and obligations when plague prevents normal business operations. The institutional adaptations that emerge from plague experience create permanent changes in commercial practice that influence international trade for centuries. The quarantine systems that develop in response to plague experience create standardized procedures for isolating incoming ships and cargo, while implementing inspection protocols that attempt to identify contaminated goods before they enter local markets. The quarantine institutions that emerge from plague experience become permanent features of international commerce that continue to influence trade practices long after plague risks subside. The route modifications that merchants adopt avoid regions with plague history, while favouring trading relationships with areas that demonstrate disease resistance or effective containment measures. The geographic patterns of international trade shift permanently as merchants redirect their activities away from plague-prone regions while developing new commercial relationships with previously marginal trading partners. The legal innovations that address plague-related commercial disruption create new categories of contract law that account for disease prevention as a legitimate reason for non-performance of commercial obligations. The legal frameworks that govern international commerce adapt to incorporate pandemic risk as a recognised business hazard that affects contractual obligations and liability allocation. The risk management strategies that merchants develop include diversification of trading partnerships to reduce dependence on plague-prone regions, insurance mechanisms that provide protection against disease-related losses, and communication systems that provide early warning about plague outbreaks in distant markets. The commercial innovations that emerge from plague experience create more resilient trading systems that can adapt to pandemic disruption. The psychological trauma experienced by surviving merchants who witness the devastation caused by plague transmission through their trade activities creates lasting guilt and anxiety that affects their willingness to resume international commerce. Some merchants abandon trade entirely and seek other occupations that don't involve the risk of spreading disease to innocent communities, creating a generation of former traders who carry psychological scars from their role in plague transmission. The merchant's guilt over his inadvertent role in plague transmission creates psychological burden that may prove more devastating than financial losses, as survivors struggle with the knowledge that their commercial activities contributed to massive human suffering. The emotional trauma that results from witnessing plague devastation, while recognising personal responsibility, creates mental health problems that affect merchant families for generations. The anxiety disorders that develop among plague-surviving merchants create occupational disability that prevents return to commercial activities even when trade opportunities become available. The psychological association between commerce and death makes it impossible for some merchants to resume trading activities without experiencing panic attacks and other symptoms that interfere with business operations. The survivor guilt experienced by merchants who escaped plague while their trading partners and customers died creates mental health problems that affect social relationships and family functioning long after plague mortality subsides. The psychological burden of survival when so many others died creates depression and social withdrawal that isolates merchant families from their communities. The career changes that plague-surviving merchants make often involve complete abandonment of commercial activities in favour of occupations that don't require travel or handling of goods that might harbour disease. The psychological trauma that merchants experience may force career transitions that eliminate valuable commercial expertise while reducing the human capital available for trade recovery. The technological innovations that emerge from plague experience include improvements in ship design and cargo handling that reduce the likelihood of rodent infestation, better preservation techniques for trade goods that minimise contamination risks, and communication systems that provide faster warning about plague outbreaks in distant regions. The technological adaptations that develop in response to plague experience create permanent improvements in commercial efficiency and safety. The ship design modifications that reduce rodent infestation include better sealing of cargo holds, improved ventilation systems that discourage rodent habitation, and construction techniques that eliminate hiding places where rats and fleas can multiply during voyages. The naval architecture that emerges from plague experience creates ships that are inherently more resistant to disease transmission. The cargo handling innovations that minimize contamination risks include packaging techniques that prevent rodent access to trade goods, fumigation procedures that eliminate insects from cargo holds, and loading methods that reduce human contact with potentially contaminated materials. The logistics improvements that develop from plague experience create safer commercial practices that reduce disease transmission risks. The preservation technologies that protect trade goods from contamination include improved storage methods that prevent rodent infestation, chemical treatments that eliminate insects from textiles and other goods, and packaging innovations that create barriers against disease vectors. The commercial technologies that emerge from plague experience improve product quality while reducing health risks. The communication systems that provide early warning about plague outbreaks include standardized reporting procedures that document disease presence in different regions, courier networks that transmit health information faster than normal commercial correspondence, and intelligence gathering systems that monitor disease patterns across international trading networks. The information technologies that develop from plague experience create more responsive commercial networks that can adapt quickly to changing health conditions. The cultural changes in medieval society following plague outbreaks include increased suspicion of foreign goods and travellers, religious movements that condemn international trade as spiritually corrupting, and political pressure for economic isolation that reduces the risks associated with commercial exchange, but also limits the benefits of international commerce. The social transformations that result from plague experience create lasting changes in attitudes toward trade and international relationships. The xenophobia that develops in response to plague experience creates social hostility toward foreign merchants and imported goods that persists long after plague risks disappear, affecting international trade relationships for generations. The cultural association between foreign contact and disease transmission creates social barriers to commercial exchange that reduce the benefits of international trade. The religious movements that interpret plague as divine punishment for commercial greed create moral pressure against international trade while promoting economic isolation as a form of spiritual purification. The theological responses to plague experience create ideological opposition to commerce that influences social attitudes toward merchants and international exchange. The political responses to plague experience include legislation that restricts international trade, immigration controls that limit foreign merchant access to domestic markets, and economic policies that promote local production over imported goods. The governmental reactions to plague experience create institutional barriers to international commerce that reduce the efficiency of economic exchange. The social movements that develop in response to plague experience often target merchant activities as sources of moral corruption, while promoting local self-sufficiency as protection against disease transmission. The cultural transformations that emerge from plague experience create social pressure for economic isolation that limits the development of international trade relationships. The documentation of plague transmission through trade routes provides modern researchers with detailed information about medieval commercial networks, while illustrating how economic integration can amplify the impact of pandemic diseases. The merchant records from plague years serve as case studies in the relationship between globalization and disease transmission that remain relevant for understanding modern pandemic risks and the challenges of maintaining international commerce during health emergencies. The historical evidence that documents plague transmission through commerce creates detailed case studies that demonstrate how economic networks can accelerate pandemic spread, while providing insights into the relationship between trade and disease transmission that remain relevant for modern global health policy. The medieval experience with plague and commerce offers lessons about pandemic risk management that apply to contemporary international trade systems. The commercial records that survive from plague years provide researchers with detailed information about medieval trade networks, while documenting the economic and social impact of pandemic disease on international commerce. The business documents that tracked plague-era trade operations create historical evidence that helps modern scholars understand both medieval commercial systems and pandemic transmission mechanisms. The parallels between medieval plague transmission and modern pandemic risks illustrate how global economic integration creates vulnerabilities to disease transmission that require careful management to balance commercial benefits against health risks. The lessons learned from medieval plague experience remain relevant for contemporary policymakers addressing pandemic preparedness and international trade regulation. The merchant story represents both the benefits and risks of international commerce, while demonstrating how economic relationships that create prosperity and cultural exchange can also serve as pathways for catastrophic disease transmission. The medieval experience with plague and trade provides historical perspective on the ongoing challenge of managing pandemic risk in an interconnected global economy. Your fellow peasants in the rural areas surrounding your village face their own version of plague horror as the disease spreads from urban centres into the countryside, where it encounters populations with no previous exposure to epidemic diseases and no resources for effective medical care or social support. The agricultural communities that form the foundation of medieval society prove particularly vulnerable to plague devastation due to their isolation, malnutrition, and complete dependence on physical labour for survival. The rural landscape that once represented stability and continuity in medieval life becomes transformed into a charnel house, where abandoned farmsteads and empty villages mark the path of plague's destruction through the countryside. The seasonal rhythms that have governed peasant life for generations are broken as the agricultural workforce disappears, leaving crops to rot in the fields while livestock wander aimlessly through deserted settlements. The arrival of plague in rural areas typically follows the movement of fleeing city dwellers who carry the disease with them as they seek refuge in the countryside, unknowingly bringing death to the very communities they hope will provide safety from the urban catastrophe. The warm welcome traditionally extended to travellers and refugees becomes a fatal mistake, as contaminated visitors introduce plague bacteria into previously unaffected agricultural populations. These urban refugees often appear healthy when they arrive in rural communities, as the incubation period of plague means that infected individuals may travel for days before showing symptoms. The hospitality that characterises peasant culture ensures that refugees are welcomed into homes and given food and shelter, creating ideal conditions for disease transmission to entire families and communities. The refugees themselves may be unaware that they carry plague, believing that their flight from the cities has saved them from the disease. Their relief at reaching the supposed safety of the countryside makes them careless about hygiene and close contact with rural families, accelerating the spread of infection through communities that have no experience with epidemic disease management. The timing of refugee arrivals often coincides with agricultural seasons when rural communities are most busy and least able to properly quarantine or monitor newcomers for signs of illness. The pressing demands of farm work mean that refugees are quickly integrated into agricultural activities, spreading the disease through work crews and farming communities. The agricultural calendar that governs peasant life becomes disrupted as plague deaths occur during critical farming seasons, leaving essential tasks unfinished and threatening food production for both local consumption and urban markets. The timing of plague outbreaks often coincides with planting or harvest periods, when the loss of agricultural workers has catastrophic implications for community survival. Spring planting becomes impossible when plague strikes during the preparation season, as weakened and dying farmers cannot prepare fields, plant seeds, or tend to livestock breeding programs that ensure future food production. The failure to complete spring agricultural tasks dooms communities to starvation, even if some individuals survive the disease itself. Harvest seasons become particularly tragic as crops ripen in fields where the farmers who planted them lie dead or dying in their homes, unable to gather the food that could sustain surviving community members. The sight of abundant crops rotting unharvested while people starve creates a cruel irony that compounds the psychological trauma of plague survival. The care of livestock requires daily attention that becomes impossible when farm families are decimated by plague, leading to the death of cattle, pigs, chickens, and other animals that represent years of investment and breeding programs. The loss of breeding stock ensures that agricultural recovery will be delayed for years, even after plague mortality subsides. The physical condition of peasant populations makes them particularly susceptible to plague mortality, as chronic malnutrition, exhausting physical labour, and exposure to harsh weather conditions have already weakened their immune systems before plague bacteria arrive in their communities. The subsistence lifestyle that barely provides adequate nutrition in normal times offers no reserves for fighting off serious disease. The dietary deficiencies common among peasant populations include lack of protein, vitamins, and minerals essential for immune system function, leaving rural populations with compromised ability to resist bacterial infections. The monotonous diet of grain porridge and occasional vegetables provides insufficient nutrition, for maintaining health during normal times, much less during the stress of epidemic disease. The physical exhaustion that characterises peasant life means that rural workers enter plague season already weakened by months or years of overwork, inadequate rest, and exposure to harsh weather conditions. The demanding nature of agricultural labour requires farmers to work long hours in all weather conditions, gradually wearing down their physical reserves. The housing conditions that expose peasants to cold, dampness and poor air quality create additional stress on immune systems that are already compromised by malnutrition and overwork. The lack of adequate clothing and heating means that peasants spend much of their lives in conditions that would be considered extreme hardship by medieval urban standards. The housing conditions in peasant villages create ideal environments for plague transmission, as large families crowd into single-room dwellings that they share with livestock and various vermin that serve as plague vectors. The lack of sanitation, clean water, and adequate ventilation in peasant homes ensures rapid disease spread once plague is introduced into the community. Peasant houses typically consist of single rooms where entire families sleep, eat, and work alongside their livestock, creating crowded conditions that facilitate disease transmission through respiratory droplets and contaminated surfaces. The absence of separate sleeping areas means that sick family members cannot be isolated from healthy individuals. The construction materials used in peasant housing include organic substances like straw, wood, and mud that provide ideal breeding grounds for fleas, rats, and other plague vectors. The gaps in wall construction allow easy access for rodents that carry plague bacteria, while the thatched roofs harbour insects and vermin that spread disease. The sanitation systems in peasant villages are primitive or non-existent, with human waste disposed of in areas close to living spaces and water sources. The contamination of wells and streams by sewage creates additional health hazards that compound the effects of plague infection, while the lack of proper waste disposal attracts rats and other disease vectors. The water sources available to peasant communities are often contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and other pathogens that weaken immune systems and make populations more susceptible to plague infection. The sharing of contaminated water sources among multiple families ensures rapid disease transmission once plague appears in the community. The social structure of peasant communities provides no resources for medical care or emergency assistance when plague strikes, as the manorial system extracts agricultural surpluses for the benefit of feudal lords while leaving peasant families with minimal reserves for crisis situations. The absence of medical practitioners in rural areas means that plague victims receive no treatment beyond folk remedies that provide no protection against bacterial infection. The feudal economic system that governs rural life ensures that peasant families have no financial reserves for purchasing medical care or additional food during health crises, as agricultural surpluses are extracted by lords and church authorities. The economic exploitation of peasant labour means that farm families live at subsistence levels, with no capacity to respond to emergencies. The isolation of rural communities means that news of plague outbreaks in other areas may not reach peasant villages until the disease has already spread to their own communities. The lack of communication networks leaves rural populations unprepared for plague arrival and ignorant of preventive measures that might reduce transmission. The absence of governmental or religious institutions capable of providing emergency assistance means that plague-affected rural communities must rely on their own depleted resources for survival. The breakdown of feudal obligations during plague years eliminates what little social support existed for peasant families during normal times. The economic impact of plague on agricultural production creates food shortages that compound the direct mortality from disease, as surviving peasants lack the workforce necessary to maintain agricultural operations while dealing with their own illness and caring for plague victims. The collapse of food production in plague-affected rural areas contributes to famine conditions that increase mortality beyond the direct effects of the disease. The disruption of food production creates a cascade of economic problems that affect entire regions, as urban areas dependent on rural agriculture face shortages and price increases that create additional social unrest and migration patterns. The breakdown of food distribution networks ensures that even areas not directly affected by plague experience economic hardship. The loss of agricultural workers during critical seasons means that crops are lost not only in the current year, but for multiple years as planting cycles are disrupted and soil preparation is neglected. The long-term nature of agricultural production means that plague's impact on food security extends far beyond the immediate mortality period. The death of livestock and the abandonment of animal husbandry programs eliminates protein sources and agricultural power that take years to rebuild. The loss of breeding animals means that livestock populations cannot be quickly restored, even when human populations begin to recover from plague mortality. The seasonal migration patterns that connect rural and urban areas facilitate plague transmission between different types of communities, as agricultural workers who travel to cities for seasonal employment bring the disease back to their home villages, while urban refugees fleeing plague introduce the infection to previously unaffected rural areas. The harvest migration that brings rural workers to cities for seasonal employment creates pathways for disease transmission as workers return to their home villages carrying plague bacteria. The timing of these migrations often coincides with periods when plague is most active in urban areas, ensuring maximum exposure to infection. The commercial relationships that connect rural producers with urban markets create additional transmission pathways as merchants and traders carry plague between communities. The economic necessity of maintaining trade relationships means that commercial activity continues even after plague appears, accelerating disease spread. The religious life of peasant communities becomes disrupted as local clergy die from plague or abandon their parishes to escape the disease, leaving rural populations without spiritual guidance or comfort during their time of greatest need. The absence of religious services and last rites creates additional trauma for surviving community members who believe that proper spiritual ministration is essential for salvation. The parish priests who serve rural communities often live in conditions similar to their peasant parishioners, making them equally vulnerable to plague mortality, while limiting their ability to provide effective spiritual care during epidemic outbreaks. The death of local clergy eliminates the religious leadership that normally provides comfort and guidance during times of crisis. The abandonment of rural parishes by clergy who flee to escape plague leaves peasant communities without access to sacraments and religious ceremonies that medieval people consider essential for spiritual welfare. The inability to receive last rites or proper burial creates additional anxiety for plague victims and their families. The feudal obligations that bind peasants to their lords become meaningless when plague kills both serfs and masters, creating a temporary collapse of the social hierarchy that normally governs rural life. However, this liberation from feudal bondage provides little benefit to peasants who are dying from plague or struggling to survive in devastated communities with collapsed infrastructure. The death of feudal lords eliminates the authority structure that normally organises agricultural labour and community defence, leaving surviving peasants without leadership or direction during the crisis. The absence of lordly authority creates power vacuums that may be filled by violence or chaos rather than beneficial self-governance. The breakdown of feudal obligations means that peasants are no longer required to provide labour service or agricultural tribute to their lords, but this freedom becomes meaningless when there is no effective community organisation to coordinate survival efforts or agricultural recovery. The knowledge systems that guide agricultural practice are threatened when experienced farmers and craftspeople die from plague, taking with them the accumulated wisdom about crop cultivation, animal husbandry, and rural technology that has been passed down through generations. The loss of this practical knowledge creates long-term challenges for agricultural recovery even after plague mortality subsides. The agricultural techniques that enable successful farming in specific local conditions are often known only to experienced farmers who have learned through years of practice and observation. The death of these knowledge holders means that surviving peasants may lack the expertise necessary to maintain agricultural productivity, even if they have access to land and tools. The craft skills that support rural communities, including blacksmithing, carpentry and textile production, may be lost entirely when skilled practitioners die from plague. The loss of these essential crafts means that surviving communities cannot maintain tools buildings and clothing necessary for basic survival. The oral traditions that preserve cultural knowledge about agricultural cycles, weather patterns, and local history are threatened when elderly community members who serve as repositories of traditional knowledge die from plague. The loss of cultural continuity affects community identity and social cohesion among survivors. The community solidarity that normally characterises peasant villages breaks down as plague creates fear and suspicion among neighbours who might previously have provided mutual support during times of crisis. The highly contagious nature of plague makes traditional community assistance dangerous, leaving plague victims isolated and abandoned even by family members. The cooperative labour systems that enable peasant communities to accomplish large agricultural tasks are disrupted when fear of contagion prevents people from working together. The breakdown of cooperative relationships means that essential tasks like harvest, construction, and defence become impossible to accomplish. The traditional mutual aid networks that provide support for widows, orphans, and disabled community members collapse when potential caregivers fear infection from close contact with vulnerable individuals. The abandonment of traditional care systems increases mortality among populations that depend on community support for survival. The migration patterns following plague outbreaks include the abandonment of entire villages, as surviving peasants flee to areas that seem unaffected by the disease, leaving behind empty fields and deserted settlements that remain uninhabited for years or decades. The demographic collapse in rural areas creates lasting changes in land use and settlement patterns that persist long after plague mortality ends. The abandonment of agricultural land means that fields return to forest or wasteland, eliminating centuries of agricultural improvement and soil cultivation. The reforestation of abandoned farmland creates barriers to future agricultural development and changes regional ecology in ways that affect long-term land use patterns. The desertion of entire villages creates ghost towns that serve as reminders of plague devastation, while providing material for folklore and oral traditions about the disaster. These abandoned settlements may remain uninhabited for generations, creating permanent scars on the rural landscape. The legal implications of plague mortality in peasant communities include questions about land tenure and inheritance when entire families die without clear heirs, creating disputes about property ownership that complicate efforts to restore agricultural production. The customary law that normally governs peasant society proves inadequate for addressing the unprecedented demographic catastrophe created by plague. The inheritance disputes that arise when entire family lines are eliminated by plague create legal challenges that medieval courts are unprepared to handle. The absence of clear heirs for abandoned property creates opportunities for land grabbing by surviving lords or wealthy individuals, but also eliminates the legitimate ownership claims that provide incentives for agricultural investment. The breakdown of customary land tenure systems means that surviving peasants may lose access to fields that their families have worked for generations, while abandoned lands may remain uncultivated because of unclear ownership status. The legal uncertainty about land rights discourages agricultural recovery efforts and investment in long-term improvements. The technological developments that emerge from plague experience in rural areas include innovations in agricultural technique that allow smaller populations to maintain food production, improvements in rural housing that reduce disease transmission risks, and changes in farming practices that account for reduced labour availability. The labour-saving agricultural techniques that develop in response to population reduction include innovations in tool design, crop selection, and farming methods that maximise productivity with minimal human input. These technological adaptations enable surviving populations to maintain agricultural production despite reduced workforce availability. The housing improvements that emerge from plague experience include better ventilation systems, separation of human and animal living spaces, and construction techniques that reduce rodent access to dwellings. These improvements reflect hard-won knowledge about disease prevention that comes at the cost of massive mortality. The cultural memory of plague in rural communities persists for generations through oral traditions, folk songs, and local customs that commemorate the devastation while providing guidance for dealing with future epidemic diseases. The collective trauma of plague experience becomes embedded in rural culture and influences community responses to subsequent health crises. The folklore that develops around plague experience includes stories about abandoned villages, ghost sightings, and supernatural explanations for the disaster that help communities process the psychological trauma of massive mortality. These cultural expressions serve as both historical records and therapeutic mechanisms for dealing with collective grief. The recovery process in plague-affected rural areas requires decades or even centuries to restore population levels and agricultural productivity, as the loss of human capital, livestock and agricultural infrastructure creates long-term obstacles to economic and social recovery. Some rural areas never fully recover from plague devastation and remain depopulated or underdeveloped for centuries. The demographic recovery that follows plague mortality often involves migration from other regions rather than natural population increase, as the time required for communities to rebuild through reproduction exceeds the economic viability of abandoned agricultural areas. The replacement populations may lack the local knowledge and cultural traditions that characterize pre-plague communities. The agricultural recovery process requires not only population replacement, but also restoration of livestock herds, soil improvement, and infrastructure rebuilding that demand significant capital investment. The long-term nature of agricultural development means that full recovery may take generations even when demographic replacement occurs quickly. The cessation of active plague transmission in your community marks not the end of suffering, but the beginning of a long struggle to rebuild civilization from the ruins left by one of history's most devastating pandemics. The survivors who emerge from their homes after months or years of isolation find themselves in a world so fundamentally altered that the society they once knew has effectively ceased to exist. The demographic impact of plague mortality becomes apparent as survivors attempt to count the living and discover that entire families, neighbourhoods, and professional guilds have been completely eliminated. The population reduction in many areas reaches levels that would be considered genocidal if caused by human action, with some regions losing 2/3 or more of their inhabitants to death or flight from plague-affected areas. The economic foundations of medieval society have collapsed as the complex networks of production, trade, and service that supported pre-plague civilization no longer exist due to the death of essential workers and the breakdown of commercial relationships. The sophisticated economic systems that took centuries to develop have been destroyed in a matter of years, requiring complete reconstruction rather than simple repair. The agricultural crisis following plague creates immediate threats to survivor welfare, as the reduced population lacks the workforce necessary to maintain food production at levels adequate for community survival. Fields lie abandoned and unharvested while livestock roam wild or die from neglect, creating food shortages that compound the direct effects of plague mortality. The social hierarchy that governed pre-plague society becomes meaningless when traditional authority figures have died, and the economic relationships that supported class distinctions no longer function. The feudal system begins to collapse as serfs abandon their obligations to dead or weakened lords, while seeking better opportunities in depopulated areas that offer higher wages and greater freedom. The technological knowledge that supported medieval civilization is threatened as master craftsmen and skilled workers die without passing their expertise to apprentices, creating gaps in essential skills that may take generations to recover. The sophisticated techniques for metalworking, construction, textile production, and other crafts that defined medieval technology face extinction due to the loss of human knowledge. The religious institutions that provided spiritual guidance and social services before plague must rebuild from devastated clerical ranks, while addressing fundamental theological questions about divine justice raised by the massive suffering witnessed during plague years. The institutional church emerges weakened and challenged by new religious movements that interpret plague as evidence of ecclesiastical corruption. The legal systems that governed pre-plague society prove inadequate for addressing the unprecedented problems created by massive mortality, including questions about property inheritance when entire family lines have been eliminated, the enforcement of contracts when parties to agreements have died, and the maintenance of civil order when traditional authority structures have collapsed. The cultural trauma of plague experience creates lasting changes in European mentality, including increased awareness of mortality, skepticism about traditional authorities, and emphasis on individual rather than communal values. The artistic and literary production of the post-plague period reflects these psychological changes, while documenting the horror and social disruptions experienced during plague years. The medical knowledge that emerges from plague experience includes improved understanding of disease transmission and the importance of quarantine measures, though the bacterial causation of plague remains unknown for centuries. The failure of traditional medical treatments during plague creates opportunities for new approaches to healing, while undermining confidence in established medical authorities. The urban planning that develops in post-plague cities incorporates lessons learned about disease transmission, including improved sanitation systems, wider streets that reduce crowding, and regulations about waste disposal that aim to prevent future epidemic outbreaks. The reconstruction of plague-devastated cities provides opportunities to implement urban design improvements that would have been impossible without the demographic catastrophe. The international relationships between regions and kingdoms are fundamentally altered as plague disrupts established political alliances and trade relationships, while creating new opportunities for territorial expansion into depopulated areas. The geopolitical map of Europe begins to change as some regions recover more quickly than others and exploit their demographic advantages. The educational systems that preserved and transmitted knowledge before plague must be rebuilt, with reduced personnel and resources while addressing the practical skills needed for social reconstruction. The universities and schools that survived plague emerge with different curricula that emphasise practical knowledge over theoretical learning. The labour relationships that develop in post-plague society reflect the increased bargaining power of surviving workers who can demand higher wages and better working conditions due to labour shortages. The traditional obligations that bound workers to employers become unenforceable when workers can easily find alternative employment opportunities. The family structures that form in post-plague society adapt to the demographic reality of reduced population by incorporating survivors from multiple family lines and creating new kinship networks that replace traditional extended families destroyed by plague mortality. The social customs governing marriage, inheritance, and family relationships evolve to address the practical needs of survivors. The long-term genetic impact of plague mortality may include selection for individuals with greater resistance to infectious diseases, though this evolutionary effect requires many generations to become apparent. The plague survivors who populate post-plague Europe may represent a genetically distinct population with enhanced immunity to some types of infectious disease. The historical memory of plague experience becomes embedded in European culture through written records, oral traditions, and cultural practices that commemorate the devastation while providing guidance for future generations facing similar crises. The collective trauma of plague becomes a defining feature of late medieval boring history for sleep. What the Black Death felt like, day by day and more.